So, morning everyone, and welcome again. I'm going to facilitate the rest of the day. You've heard the key questions from Mazi, Macquarie, and on my left is our esteemed panel, and by left I mean ideologically speaking. It's funny that we're sitting in the middle because it's not where he belongs.
Push him there.
And Lumkile is rightfully placed on the left, far left. But let's kick off with Elise Kruger, who's an economist at NKC Economics, has 22 years of experience, has worked in several different sectors. And so, Elise, those are the questions you've heard from Ed. What do you think? We've got 10 minutes.
Okay, yes. Starting off with the outcome of the national elections, I do believe that President Ramaphosa got a fairly good mandate to push through on structural reform. And that could steer South Africa's economy into a new direction. Having said that, there are many constraints and hurdles and obstacles for that path. It's not going to be easy. Therefore, I think one must caution to be overly optimistic, having too high expectations in the next, say, 6 to 12 months. This will take time to see this ship turning around. And I think one should appreciate the magnitude of the task that lies ahead. And the new government will have to root out endemic corruption. They'll have to strengthen and focus on state-owned enterprises that were basically managed down to the ground over the past decade. That's a huge task. They will have to look at failed economic policies and also look at state growth fallacies that will have to make space for market-orientated policies. So it's a magnitude of different layers that will have to be addressed to turn this economy around. But yes, growth indeed is the absolute necessity, and not only growth, but growth that could generate jobs to turn the South African economy around. If we do not see that, then we will have in South Africa pretty similar to what we've got used to over the past 10 years or so. So though I'm optimistic, I'm also realistic that it could take a lot longer to see actual growth coming through. Though we are coming off a low base, so if we can manage to see progress, that could start to foster confidence levels as well. And I'm also encouraged, if I think about President Ramaphosa, we've heard a lot about him, but if you think about the past 15 months that he already had in the office, he actually did a lot of footwork for the task that's now ahead. And just refreshing your memory that we've had the investment conference where about 300 billion rands of investment pledges from private sector and international, or local and international investors were made. And already we had a bit of a progress update on that in Feb at the budget. It was indicated that about 187 billion of that's already been implemented, and another 26 billion is in pre-implementation phase. So that's been done. Named at the time, there was the Economic Recovery and Stimulus Program with some specific actionable points put on the table. Yes, we haven't quite seen any implementation, and that's why the next phase, the main focus will be there. But if you think about, just reminding you again about the focus areas of that plan, it's all issues that we at this point dearly need in the South African economy. The implementation of growth-enhancing economic reforms, the prioritization of public spending to support job creation, the establishment of an infrastructure fund to facilitate private-public partnerships, addressing urgent and pressing matters in education and health, and investing in municipal social infrastructure improvement. Those were the 5 main pillars of what was announced. That's the footwork that's been done. That's now handy in the phase where you need to start to implement. You could add to that, already last year, President appointed the committee that will look at the state efficiency and the size of government. We should this week start to see the implementation of the work that has been done on that. Add to that your job summit, the commissions, all of those are footwork that now can start to end up in implementation post-elections. So yes, really what we should look out for is implementation. If we were to gather again in 6 months' time or even a year, and we cannot show the progress from now in a year's time, now then South Africa really has deep trouble. So we need to see progress, be it small, be it piecemeal, be it gradual, at least progress that we are moving in the right direction. And from that point of view, I mean, it's early days, we're still awaiting the cabinet announcements, but really to look at flags along the way to see in which direction the country is heading. And I've listed a couple of those. I mean, this week, the news and the first flag would be the composition of government. Now, will Ramaphosa manage to get rid of all the dead wood that he had to carry along prior to the elections? If you look at the size of the state, will it be a notable reduction that could also play into a lower state salary bill in the medium term? Looking at another flag would be prosecution of corrupt ANC officials, but also private sector players involved in state capture. Will we actually see somebody behind bars in six months' time? Will there be tangible action? Developments on Eskom of critical importance. What will we see in the next 6 months in terms of progress on implementation of plans on unbundling? And now we've got key positions vacant, not only CEO, but there was also the talk about a turnaround officer, not yet appointed. That was in Feb. So the months flew by, and we need to see what are the actual actions on Eskom. Governance of state-owned enterprises. I mean, what will happen in the next while? Will there be more bailouts? Will there be restructuring? Will there be actual talk of partial privatization? Will there be closing down of some? So what are on the table for that? Labour market reform. How will President Ramaphosa handle the unions in the country? Is there a notable difference in the way unions react to the new president? Then on to things like regulatory changes. We've got the action plans on the table about the allocation of spectrum, about visa requirements, but we haven't seen the actions yet. And then also on policy development and also clarity on policy. I think that is of utmost importance to see in the next while, not only on the hot potato issues like land reform and nationalization of the Reserve Bank, but also in the broader sense. And now if you think about energy policy, I think something I picked up a week or what ago was the announcement by the Minister of Energy that he actually we approved a deviation from the integrated resource plan to enable the licensing of the small generation facilities, 1 megawatt to 10 megawatt. And that's a good step. That's an early indication that something's going to change, that will help us on our energy supply, on reducing our dependence on Eskom. So small announcements starting to come through on policy that could make a difference for the country. So we should be alert in the next 6 to 12 months to pick up on small developments which could over time result in more momentum flowing. And I think as we start to see this gradual improvement, that will start to foster confidence. Investors and private sector will say, you know what, it seems like the new government's going to walk the talk. And I think there will be some some goodwill once we start to see implementation. But there's been a lot of talks, and because prior to the elections we were in sort of muddle along mode waiting for the elections. Now election outcome is there. Now we wait for the cabinet, but soon thereafter we should start to see small progress as we enter the next sort of 6 to 12 months. So yes, I remain cautiously optimistic, and I think we'll also have validation of this. So if we move in the right direction, come the next ratings agency report, say November, we should start to see signals, encouraging signals saying, yes, we see small progress in the right direction. This ship cannot turn around overnight. It will be a medium to a longer term process, but if we start to do the right things, you can start to bear fruit into the medium term. Thanks, I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Elise. Before we go on, one quick question to you. What do you see as the medium term?
I would say 3 to 5 years.
So the first term of this president.
Yes, I would basically say so. So I think we might also have a scenario where it will feel as if everything is worse before it gets better. Especially looking at just this year's economic growth outcome, already it's going to be a lot worse than what we hoped for. And we could see a bit more of that, given that I would say that the fiscal space for some of these necessary reforms would be limited given the low growth environment. So in a way, it's a bit of a chicken egg. We need to get growth to get things going, but growth is quite low for now. So yeah, almost prepare yourself for a bit of worse news before it gets better. But if we do see some of the progress coming through, it will bear fruit in the medium term. Yes.
So in 3 to 5 years. Sizwe, our next speaker, Sizwe Mpofu Walsh, who is, if Elise was a specialist economist, Sizwe is a bit of a polymath, author, scholar, activist, partly, and also a media innovator. He was president of the SRC at UCT and currently holds an MA in international relations, wait for it, from Oxford, and is busy doing his PhD. Do you agree, Sizwe? 3 to 5 years? Does the president have the space?
Do I have 10 minutes?
Yep. You'll get another bite at the cherry.
Thanks. I agree that that's the term, but my analysis cuts against the grain of, I think, the prevailing consensus at the moment.
Surprising for a musician, you don't know how the sound stuff works.
Thanks. Well, if you want rap, then I'm going to have to increase the payment levels. So yeah, I think that analysis is spot on a number of questions. My analysis cuts against the prevailing consensus to a large extent. I think that we certainly are emerging from a period of significant decline, and some might even suggest devastation. But I'm a lot less optimistic that we are going into a period of reform and renewal, never mind a new dawn. I think what we're going into now is a period of intense ambiguity, and I think that President Ramaphosa's term as a whole is going to be characterized by this ambiguity. On the one hand, offering the population enough hope to believe that change is on some kind of horizon, but on the other hand, constantly being reeled back in by the reality of the political situation inside the ANC and the political situation inside the country and the economic situation. So I actually think what we're going to see is more of the same from what we've seen in President Ramaphosa's first 18 months. Does my 10 minutes start now? So, yes, I'd like to just focus the brief remarks around 4 questions. Firstly, the contrast effect that I think has painted President Ramaphosa in a more positive light than I think is due. Secondly, just talk about what I think is a period of unprecedented political contestation that our country faces in the Ramaphosa term of office, and especially in the next year. And then speak about some of the economic tensions that will pervade that period. And I think it was put very well in our introduction. I would rephrase it to a balance between reform and recovery, as opposed to one of just reform and growth. And then finally speak about some of the key policy questions that will be before this government, and make the argument that we're going to enter an era of even more policy ambiguity. So just on the first point, the contrast effect, a cognitive bias where if you see something in contrast to another thing, you accentuate the elements of that thing which contrast it to the other thing, which prevents you from seeing it in isolation for its true nature. And I think President Ramaphosa is one of the biggest beneficiaries of the contrast effect, not only in South African history, but probably in world history, because the presidency which preceded Ramaphosa was so devastating that the contrast effect has forced us to see President Ramaphosa in a light that I think is very seductive for us to believe is true. But I think when we really boil down the politics in the ANC, the politics in the country, and the economy, if we're really honest with ourselves, the halo that has been cast over President Ramaphosa, I think will slowly, over his term in office, begin to fray and begin to disintegrate. President Ramaphosa is far better for South Africa than President Zuma, in my view. President Ramaphosa may well stop the bleeding. President Ramaphosa doesn't seem to have an agenda to actively attack institutions. But stopping the bleeding is far from what's necessary for South Africa, its politics and its economy to recover. Stopping the bleeding just means that we may just have a sick patient that's not bleeding anymore. And so in many ways, I think the current media consensus, the current consensus among most political analysts suffers from this contrast effect and is painting President Ramaphosa and what he's actually able to do, and even himself, in an unduly positive light. And if we remove the contrast, I think we'll see the situation for its true complexity. So to come on to some of the contestations that I think will surround the ensuing period. Firstly, we're entering an era of unprecedented political contestation on the macro political level, to the extent that in provincial legislatures across the country and in parliament, politics has never been more competitive. It's not as competitive as it might be, but it's more competitive than it's ever been. So majorities are significantly reduced for the ANC in a number of legislatures, not just here in Gauteng, for example, where the majority hangs on a knife's edge, but also in places like KwaZulu-Natal, where the majority has significantly diminished. And the same story is true in the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces. I was in the media gallery at the first sitting of the National Assembly, and for the first time as I overlooked the House, essentially both the ANC takes up the one aisle and the opposition essentially takes up the other aisle, give or take a few seats on this side. And I don't think we've actually, because in the afterglow of President Ramaphosa's mandate, there's been much celebration. I don't think we've actually fully internalized what that means for the legislative process in South Africa, that committee hearings, that full sittings of the National Assembly, that provincial legislatures across the country will now enter an era where it won't be as easy for the ANC to dictate what the outcome of the legislative process will be. And throw that into the mix of an economy which is experiencing tepid renewal at best. And you have a period of very interesting but very serious political contestation, where also the fundamental assumptions, the basic rules of the political game have come into question by those who are contesting the ANC more than ever. But also at the micro-political level, if you will, all three of South Africa's major parties, in my view, are about to enter concurrent political battles. So let's take the ANC. The ANC is probably as divided as it's ever been. In my view, there are three basic factions: hardline Ramaphosa supporters, people in the middle who will go whichever way power tells them to go, and hardline, let's call them the once Zuma faction. And we can pretend like there's no contestation, and we can pretend like David Mabuza didn't just hold up the entire cabinet process, and we can pretend like Ace Magashule isn't the CEO of the ANC. But it's not going to disappear. Ramaphosa might give nice speeches that make us think it might disappear, but it's not going to disappear because the ANC is fundamentally divided. Now, President Ramaphosa may be a skilled political tactician, and he may, in his first term, work through the political dynamics that mean that his majority increases. But even if that's the case, which I believe is the best case scenario for him, that's going to be a very painful process of political contestation within the ANC. And so as the election ends and the veneer of unity within the ANC subsides, an increased period of contestation, in my view, is inevitable within the ANC. And President Ramaphosa has to act, he has to appear decisive, and so he actually has to take that faction head on. And that will only increase the contestation, and we'll have to see what the counterattack is. Many people are now suggesting that counterattack will be muted. I disagree fundamentally. The Democratic Alliance also has its own internal contestations. There's even rumors of a possible split within the party. And I think we're going to see a big battle within the DA after these election results for the soul of that party, and it's not clear which way that contestation will go. And this will be happening concurrently with the ANC's battle. And then the EFF goes to its National People's Assembly in December this year. And while it seems to be more united than the ANC at the top leadership level, going into a national convention with new MPs, a bigger party than ever, is likely also to bring contestation, and there may be contestations for senior positions within the EFF. And this will be happening concurrently, as I say, with the macro picture, the ANC picture, and the DA picture. So we're entering a very intense period of political contestation, and of course the economic consequences that flow from that are in some respects self-evident, in that I think we'll see ambiguity as opposed to decisiveness. And so this all comes against the backdrop. This would all be wonderful if our economy was growing and we had political contestation and democracy was flourishing, but unfortunately this period of political contestation coincides with a period of economic stagnation. And President Ramaphosa's virtually impossible task is to navigate a very strong reform agenda which ameliorates not only hardliners in his own party, but also the increasing opposition, and at the same time preserves recovery, economic stability, and fiscal space. And so I think President Ramaphosa is between a rock and a hard place, and what he will do is continue to charm us into believing that change is on the horizon, while battling furiously to try and piece together a coalition that will keep our country stable. And ultimately, I think the result of that will be more of the same, muddling through, give and take, ambiguity. And it's better that we know there's going to be ambiguity than assume there's going to be this new moment and it never comes. And so I think one aspect of that, as I approach the final 2 minutes, is that the policy environment, in my view, is going to demonstrate continued incoherence. Let's just look at the policy environment. Remember the old NDP? There's still that thing, apparently. Then President Ramaphosa came with what he called the New Deal while he was running as ANC president, which he announced here in Sandton. Then we forgot about the New Deal, and Ramaphosa came with the stimulus package last year, which you may have also forgotten about. On top of the stimulus package, there's the ANC's resolutions, which in many ways contradict all three of those earlier policies. There are key questions about land, nationalization of the reserve bank, state participation in the economy, what happens with ESCOM. And essentially, I think across the full gamut of political policy, we will see continued ambiguity, a continued effort to speak to some constituencies in one way and other constituencies in another way. And essentially, policy will remain roughly the same as it is now, while those conversations continue to happen to different constituencies. And so my message is not one of hope. My message is not one of a new moment in South African politics, echoing the earlier views that this is going to be a difficult and a complex process. And I think we must ensure that we don't allow the contrast effect to overshadow the very serious complexities and difficulties which the South African government and therefore the South African economy will confront in the immediate period, the first year, and in the Ramaphosa term to follow.
Thank you, Sizwe. For all of you who are unsure about what did you call it? What effect is that?
Ambiguity.
No?
The contrast effect.
Contrast effect. Anyone know what's the contrast effect? We like Ramaphosa simply because he isn't Zuma.
Yeah. Basically.
Lumkile? Lumkile, of course, hopefully will temper something between these two views, because we do have two distinct views. Despite Sizwe pretending that him and Elise have a consensus, they don't. Elise believes that there's stabilization and growth. Sizwe is taking up a step back, saying you first need recovery, then stabilization. So your common ground is stabilization, but your starting points are fairly different. Lumkile, an academic economist at Wits, I was taught by him a little bit. He was also an investment professional, has a long history, has been at the IDC, also formerly a political activist, but now an academic and practicing economist. Hopefully you can temper these two views.
I'll try. So firstly, I'm sitting here very disappointed by the outcome of the results. Here is a party that has destroyed all institutions of our constitutional new emerging democracy, whether it's the prosecuting authority or the investment institutions such as the Public Investment Corporation, you name it. Unemployment is at 27.1%. Youth unemployment and those, in fact, that are not employed or in education and training, about 38%. So really, this is a party that needs to be booted out, and yet it gets voted in. And so basically, over the 25 years, it's a party that has shown us how it should not be given power to run South Africa and deliver on the inequality, poverty that we inherited from the apartheid system. So what do we know and how do we move forward? So what we do know is that racial, or let me call it this way, the identity economics and politics which have been inherited from apartheid, the ANC didn't even dust the menu, took that blueprint as it inherited from the apartheid regime. We know that racial-based economic development starts very, very well and ends in tears, as we saw the apartheid regime. So regimes that pursue these policies run huge deficits and run huge levels of debt, as we've seen with the apartheid regime, now the ANC regime, which is running a fiscal deficit close to 5%, is running a budget, a debt to GDP economy that is approaching 60%. And inequality has widened under this regime. So what I'm saying to you is that sitting here today and looking ahead, I'm surprised that people are optimistic when in fact with a 25-year record, where we can look and say, actually, what has happened to this institution called the ANC? And from what we know 25 years later, can something be different looking forward? I think people are just playing with people's feelings. That, you know, having that record in 5 years, you think when you look forward, there'll be change. I think a lot of us are wasting a lot of energy and engagement. So this party needed to put it out completely, but it's still there. So what can it do differently? So the first issue that's got to deal with is creating its capability within the state. So institutions have been destroyed. So we know that the capability of the state has been weakened tremendously. And in a society whereby education remains a big problem, and there is skills shortage because of an exodus that has again continues of capable and skilled individuals, that our skill set has thinned tremendously, particularly the experienced skill set. So Ramaphosa's responsibility of recreating this institution will demand quite a lot from him. He started very well through the commissions that all of us know. So really, I'm looking forward to Hemone Kronye nailing some of these individuals. I think to deal with some of the issues that Suze has highlighted within the ANC, of those three sets, with the Ramaphosa, Zuma, or Mahashule, and the middle ground, the only best way of dealing with them is to start nailing all of them. We have got evidence against them, so I'm hoping that Himione is going to start reading and knocking at the doors and nailing them. And I think that will send a lot of, that will shake the ANC than before. Starting with Zuma going on at the moment, because I think what we're seeing is that Zuma, on the old case, we need to lay more charges, because there are lots of other things that is done. So if you can lay more charges in addition to what is there, and then the rest, like Mahashul and others, get nailed, I think that should bring some stability, or some sort of stability, and allow Ramaphosa some space, because here, those that are there will start doubting themselves whether that project of repurposing the state and institution for private gain can be retained going forward. In the midst of all this mixture and ambiguity, stealing from Sizwe's term, is that once countries have gone down the way we've gone, whether the apartheid regime, as we saw it, and the ANC regime has gone this way, recovery and economic development that's inclusive is very, very, very hard. In an environment of slowing a global economy, of resurgence of protectionism and identity politics globally. So with this gloom, really, let me now look at macro level what needs to do and the physical space. At macro level, as we all know, he needs to really come out very clear around the resolutions from Nasrec, specifically around the role of the central bank. He needs to just to bury that debate completely and allow the Minister of Finance and Reserve Bank to play a critical role in terms of managing the macro environment. The key here is then what policy, what macroeconomic policy are we going to develop? Because we've seen whether it's GEAR, New Growth Path, and the rest that Sid was talking about, they've failed. Our economy is an economy that benefits us, the elite, and it's a very exclusionary economy. Therefore, a macroeconomic policy has to talk about inclusivity. How do you create opportunities for the rest of the society using the macroeconomic policy levers available from the Reserve Bank, as well as how we can use both SARS and the Treasury in terms of stimulating economic development without going populist, given our idea of trying to build a macroeconomic environment that can create inclusive opportunities. On the fiscal space, arguably, as some of you might have seen, Moody's does accept that South Africa does have fiscal space. So Moody's talks about 70%, that given where we are, even if we go to 70%, they can understand, provided that extra expenditure will be coming into an investment-led economic growth strategy. What will that entail? We know sitting here that identity economics doesn't work. We have also seen in the past, since 2007, how identity economics destroyed the industrial base of South Africa. We know that in the industry, or what we call manufacturing, not only is it value additive, it is also labor intensive. The ANC-led regime, through its black economic empowerment policies, did not award those contracts that went both to Transnet as well as Eskom, amongst others, to local industrial players that were long history of capability. Instead chose black deal makers who were linked to external players, whether it's Chinese, whether it's the French Alstom, or it's the American GE, instead of using the local base, because those local industrialists are white. and sacrifice hundreds, if not thousands, of black employees who work for these white industrialists that have got a history of capability. They've invested heavily on machinery. And our government is investing, but they're not seeing any deal flow because of the black deal makers, the black middle men, I call them men because predominantly men, so apologies women, who are sitting there, they just do deals. They get a 4 score of a percent, and then they bring the Chinese or the Alstom, etc. And there is no capability creation. So this is a huge issue around these black economic empowerment policies, where people talk about industrialists, they talk about participation, but they're lazy to learn and create capability. So you've got a continuity of exclusion, not only because of historical inheritance, but being reinforced by the ANC policies. So what I'm saying is that in an ANC rule, nothing much is going to change. So it's going to be more or less of the same, trying to mend the damage. So really, South Africans need to think seriously about electoral reform and opening spaces for emergence of new institutions. Because the current big institution that seems or is seen to be representing the black society, black community at large, is failed to deliver. It's never going to deliver because simply it's driven by individual interest and the identity of the ANC. Thank you.
Ooh. So you're all taking your money and running. Well, there are 3 very distinct views. One, which is saying expect some growth. You can moderate your expectations, but there'll be some growth. A second, which is saying you limp along. And a third, which is saying we need fundamental reinvention. And fundamental reinvention to you guys, I'm sure, is not very comforting because it means, in Sizwe's words, disruption. And you guys don't like disruption because you like stability. So what's the prognosis for stability? What's the prognosis for, I mean, I know Sizwe, you're saying we're limping along, but Elise, do you agree that we're just going to limp along, or is the recovery going to actually spur some kind of growth, and these guys should have some incentive to remain and reinvest? Or do they take Lumpile's view and say, gosh, it's going to be all up in the air?
If I could reply, I think Sizwe represented the worst case scenario. If we do not see any notable change from the way we've seen over the past decade, then we are going to go muddling along, going nowhere, slowly down and over the hill, and junk status and all of the negative complications of that. I strongly believe that the fact that the economy is as bad as it is and has been for a couple of years is actually a positive in Ramaphosa's hand, negotiating structural reform. Because if you look at unemployment out there, youth unemployment specifically, it's all, again, back to a function of growth. If there's no growth, there's no real opportunity for employment. So if we're going to be stuck in low growth as a result of the policies that maybe some of the factions are still hanging on to, we're going to have more of the same, more unemployment, less satisfaction out there for the voter population, as opposed to saying, no, these are possible changes that could bring us growth. We've up till this point, we're almost junk status, we've just diverted that. Let's do X, Y, Z, and we see what the results are. So I think it could be a positive, the fact that the economy is as weak. Not to say that it reduces the complexity of the story. I think it is quite difficult, given that the fiscal space is limited in this low growth environment. But it could also be a card saying, either we do the next, X, Y, Z structural reforms, or we end up also eventually having to go sort of with a asking hand to the IMF saying this country is completely bankrupt, you couldn't manage to get growth going, please help us out with all the stringent requirements going with that. But maybe if I could just also say something on your view, Lumkile. Thinking back, pre-Zuma era, to budget surpluses in this economy. Yes, the global economy helped us at that stage, but we were not always into budget deficits to the extent we are in now. So we've had a good buffer in the good years managed by Minister Trevor Manuel at the time, Pravin Gordhan at revenue side. The economy was actually well functioning up until a point. A leadership change and 10 lost years resulted in this feeling that, you know, it's 25 years lost. I think we've had some progress up to a point, and then it's almost as if there was a structural break in the performance. And the last 10 years have now, you know, left us all disillusioned with no hope. But actually, if you think back prior to the Zuma era, we've had a period where the economy was quite well run in terms of the fiscal management side, monetary side, and also our revenue side. And those pillars, you know, obviously have started to crumble in the last decade. So from that perspective, I think, you know, I would hope not to be overly negative, thinking we could maybe start to regain some of that confidence and credibility, obviously with the right people in the right positions. I think that's key, and then also with making a couple of difficult decisions as to from here onwards, how will we recover? So I agree there's a recovery phase, but it will have to run simultaneously with some structural reform as well.
Can I say something?
You will get a bite at the cherry, Lumkile.
Thanks
Hold
so
on.
much.
I need to go to the floor.
Yes.
If there are any burning questions before we allow the panelists to round up, because you each had your more than 10 minutes.
Sure.
But nevertheless, can I have an indication? 1, 2, 3. It's the only questions I'm going to take.
Back.
Please be as brief as possible.
It's on at the back.
Okay, 4. Right, that's it.
I think one thing that at least all three of you agree on is that there have to be very, very big structural reforms here.
Yeah, it's in my head.
I think that's one thing that we all agree on.
That's better. So, yeah, I think that's the one thing you all agree on, is that there has to be very big structural reforms. The previous speaker here, Vali Musa, he said that the president is a man of consensus. He likes to keep everyone happy. Do you think that way of operating, by keeping everyone happy, can you actually achieve those structural reforms that are needed with a man that likes to keep everyone happy and tries to avoid conflict? Or do you think you need someone that is ruthless and will come in and clean the ship completely and implement his own reforms and his own agenda without trying to keep everyone happy at the same time when there are big conflicts?
Thank you.
Morning. I think I have one question for Lumkile and one question for Sizwe. Lumkile, on your analysis, bleak as it might be, I think there is quite some good points that you raise. The question, therefore, that I would then now ask, which ties into to the previous question, do we then, in your opinion, have the right man in the saddle? Secondly, don't you think that the resurgence of this identity politics, both from the left and the right, would actually be the impetus that would actually bring the ANC under Ramaphosa administration to start addressing the very same issues that you've highlighted? For Sizwe, if you look at the EFF, the EFF will be going to its elective conference at the end of the year. And when I make a quick analysis of the EFF, except, of course, the older generation in the EFF, including your father and Macquarie, you have people in their mid-30s who have very strong personalities. And you have the follies who have come in. who have come in. Don't you think, therefore, that you will start having fissions within the EFF that are going to be very prominent, that would actually prevent them from growing on a very accelerated growth trajectory?
Lumgile, I've just got one question for you. You mentioned quite briefly while going through your macroeconomic policies that we need to implement for a changing South Africa. You said we could use SARS and Treasury to stimulate the economy. Other than tax reforms, is there something else that you might have been thinking in terms of what SARS and Treasury could contribute?
One question for Lumgile. You said you were very disappointed with the election's outcome. Was there an alternative? Because sometimes it's easy to get rid of what you have, and when you don't have an alternative, it becomes another crisis. Thank you.
Okay, panelists, who wants to shoot? Elise.
Okay, I'll start off. I think I only have one question. That's the first one. For the rest seem to have
But
been
also
addressed.
make up your summing remarks.
Okay. So the question on consensus. I think there's going to be a point where some difficult decisions will have to be made that would not keep all parties happy at that time. Thinking about unions and the sort of powerful impact unions has had on the economy in the last couple of years, we won't be able to keep unions happy all the time and grow the economy, or sort out Eskom's problems and keep the whole workforce of Eskom employees. So there's going to be times when I think Ramaphosa will have to show his hand more strict and say, listen, we cannot have all employees and turn the situation around. Part of the solution is we need to cut workforce by X thousand, obviously trying to alleviate the pain, but yes, there will be situations where I think, you won't get all parties happy all the time. Otherwise, we won't be able to turn the economy around. But yes, and then maybe just my last point is I'll remain cautiously optimistic as we go into the next 6 to 12 months. We'll watch out for the flags, and if that will actually steer us to believe in what direction we go. So not to say all flags will be positive, there might be two steps ahead and one step back. But if we can have the majority of developments, starting to show change, that will start to foster confidence and that could get some momentum going. Thanks.
Sure, I'll start with the first question, which I think strikes to the heart of this conjuncture, because what I think we ultimately need is someone to just be brave enough to be decisive. I think there are two kinds of views on what structural reforms should be. There's one view which is we should deregulate completely, we should trim the state completely, and we should essentially pursue one largely neoliberal model of structural reform. And there are some benefits that flow from that if you do it all the way.
Sure.
There's another view which is the state should intervene more decisively in the economy, play a much more redistributive role, grasp the nettle of land reform, and pursue structural reforms in that direction. And there are benefits that flow from that, particularly redistributive and equality benefits, if you do it all the way. Where we, I think, stand, and where I think President Ramaphosa is perfect to stand, but where I think he will stand, is trying to mediate and muddle through those two structural reforms. And he'll be brilliant at that, but that will be bad for the country, I think, because we won't get the benefits of a decisive trimming of the size of the state, nor will we get a fully redistributive program. We'll stay where we are in the middle, which is pretending we're going to redistribute and pretending we're going to cut the state, and doing exactly the same thing we've been doing for the last 5 years, in my view. So that's what I think President Ramaphosa will do. Coming on to the EFF, I think that we will see, and this was the point that I was trying to make, more contestation within the EFF than we've seen up to now. It's quite fun when you have 25 MPs, because that's a relatively small group to control in Parliament. And I think we saw quite remarkable unity in the EFF up to now. But 44 MPs is a completely different kettle of fish. I think keeping that caucus unified, particularly when you're trying to pull very risky political stunts, is going to be a lot harder. And I think what we might see leading up to the National People's Assembly, which I think is going to be quite an interesting political event in December, is some contestation for positions at the top of the EFF. And that'll be a new test for the party. And I wouldn't be surprised if we do see an increasing factionalization and contestation within the EFF. And remember that the ANC's two oppositions are pulling it in both directions. So the earlier structural reforms I mentioned align very closely with DA policy. So DA will be pushing pro-recovery reforms. The EFF wants the opposite structural reforms. They'll be pushing for redistributive policy, state participation and intervention. And so you've got both opposition parties pulling in opposite directions, and both factions within the ANC pulling in those two opposite directions. And again, this is why, just to end off, my view is, firstly, and Elise is completely right, and I don't think she has taken the full New Dawn position, which I accept and I think is correct. But to those who do take the full New Dawn position, show me the data.
Sure.
What is your evidence? Cyril gave a nice speech. President Cyril Ramaphosa gave a nice speech. Show me the growth evidence. Show me the unemployment evidence. Show me the poverty evidence. Show me the ESCOM evidence. Show me the land evidence. Until I see any evidence, apart from very nice speeches, I'm not going to change my position on where it's going to go. And cabinet will be very interesting, because it seems to me that everyone celebrated and thought, Ramaphosa's about to get tough. Mabuza's gone. The moment is upon us. Oh, now look where we are. Mabuza, I think it's quite embarrassing. He's held up the entire cabinet process, and now he's happy. He's going to come back and dictate that he will be deputy president. And for me, that's evidence to suggest that this thing is deeply contested. And so, in my view, I don't see anything above 3%. President Ramaphosa may reprice our debt, which I think would be great. He will stop the bleeding in institutions. We may see some prosecutions. But whether he has the wherewithal, given the complexity of the situation, to fundamentally transform a deeply divided politics and economics, I will remain deeply skeptical of.
Yeah. So my idea was that the ANC goes below 50 because there's so much common between the ANC and the DA in terms of economic policy that the two form a grand coalition. So the ANC typically was 45%, the DA 20%. The two of them then will come together and form a grand coalition and move us forward. And I think that combination will be the combination that starts to build a nation, that starts thinking about inclusivity and move us away from identity economics and identity politics. Another thing that the government can do around the issue that you raised is really the space. There's two issues. The first issue, the return of Maria Ramos. So Maria Ramos' mandate, either way, whether she becomes Minister of Finance or whatever role she plays as the Chief Restructuring Officer, her responsibility is going to help us to restructure a lot of the debt that is embedded across many state-owned enterprises, where we look at cheap funding, whether it's climate finance in relation to ESCOM, with a lot of cheap money around that. So lots of stuff that's going to see coming through around the financing packages and innovation embedded, because there's a lot of money in the global economic space where many institutions are looking for low carbon emission opportunities, climate-orientated investment, and really impact investment. So that's where the money is going. I forgot what your question was.
What I was saying is, doesn't the emergence of these two extremes, both to the left and the right of the ANC, offer an opportunity for the ANC to actually start addressing exactly those reforms that are required: inequality, restructuring.
I've got that. So just at a parting shot and respond to Liz. So that's a beauty, Ibrahim, of looking at this thing in this historical context. Guys, there's continuities. There's been any breaks in the development of South African capitalism. Botha package in 1988, huge reforms, got kicked out to touch. He tried to do a little around macroeconomic policy and the Reserve Bank through the Decor Commission recommendation. The De Villiers Commission that talked to ESCOM fell flat. And privatization, at least ESCOM ISCO was privatized, but nothing really much happened after. The ANC, in the growth, employment, and redistribution, which was supposedly to be social reform, we know what happened to it. That the left ganged up towards Polokwane, and you know what happened to that. So really, what we've seen, what Elise says was economic growth, etc. There were two important factors that drove that growth. The innovation that was happening in the period, the dot-com innovation that happened between 2001 and 2007, and the global super commodity cycle. So those two really drove everything. If you look at anything outside services, the manufacturing sector continued going down. There were opportunities given the package of that surplus we're talking about, which should have been a package that underpins re-engineering and re-industrialization, went nowhere. So really, it was just serendipity. There is no, in the 25 years, there is no evidence of social reforms, except for opening up the financial sector and liberalizing, making sure that all of you guys can participate in the global economy and make the margin that you do make. But what we want a radical program for inclusion. We can't live in a country with such levels of inequality. It's just unacceptable as a humankind. Thanks.
So if we want a middle path between Lumkile's extremism, Sizwe's limping along, and Elise's cautious optimism, the ANC needs to split, basically. Whether you have the appetite for that kind of instability in the short term is a different question. But that's what I take out of what they're saying. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We will have a very quick